So, final little table, the other thing that I'd ask before we go and design rates, if the 14, so basically what I'm asking council, not, you don't have to vote on anything, I'm just asking for direction, a general direction, if the 14.9 seems acceptable, and if it does, what I'm asking, the second component, this is all financial plan stuff. Then we get into the cost of service side, and that's where we get into really nitty-gritty where costs should be going and the nuts and bolts and the bulk of the work. And so here's a chart on table 1 and 2, just the costs, very preliminary look of what the revenues are recovered from these classes and the cost to serve those classes. And so we're not going to be swinging, you know, customers all over the place, but what we're asking for is some sort of window to operate to raise or to move classes closer to their respective cost of service. So what I'm saying is, I'm starting with a recommendation of 3%, which, let me try to explain this. The overall revenue increase to the town of Lakeview will be 14.9%. But in order to move some customers closer to their respective cost of service, I have a 3% window, so I can raise rates on a class 3% higher, but no higher than 17.9, or for classes that are overpaying, less than 14.9, but no lower than 11.9. Now, council, I'm asking direction if that's too aggressive, not aggressive enough. Traditionally, with a 14.9, it's pretty a higher end increase. 3% is not a very large window. It does not mean that a class is going to have, you know, classes are going to be 17.9, 11.9, 17.9, 11.9. The math doesn't work that way. So, for example, your residential class is so large, I probably could not give them the minimum or maximum, because then it wouldn't work out. Your overall increase would be too high or too low. But what I'm saying is, I'm not just doing a flat 14.9 on everything. Then you have no cost of service. I'm going to go in and look at, you know, what the rates need to do on the blocks and on the demands and on the customer charges and things like that. And so what I'm saying is, these percentages, you might have 15.5 on one and another might be 13.2, but the overall for the city is 14.9. Does that do an okay job? Sometimes that's a little confusing for people, but that's basically, so the action I'm asking for is direction on the 14.9, and if the plus or minus 3 is acceptable. If not, what level on both of those would you like to see, essentially, is where I'm at. That way I can go back and design these rates and have them ready for you for the next meeting. I won't be here, but I'll have, unless you want me to be here, and then I'll have them in ordinance form. And
the 3% difference, that's what most towns look at?
Well, it depends on the level of the increase. For example, if I was recommending a 4% increase, I might only have a plus or minus 1, because that's you know, then I'm from 3 to 5. On a 4% increase, that's 25% swing. Versus if I'm projecting, say, a 20% increase, I might say plus or minus 5, because, you know, it's the same percentage of change, 5 on 20 versus 1 on 4. So it's really up to, and it's also depending on the numbers. Now, actually, to be honest, I was telling Scott, you guys, you look at those large percentages, but don't look at the deviation from 0. Look at the deviation from 17.4. And you're really not that far out of whack. You take the public authority out of it, you're really not that far out of whack from the 12.9, 6.4, 18.7, 26.9. They're all fairly, I've seen, let me just say, I've seen all over the map. Negatives, a negative 30 on the one, and the other's plus 20. One class is just severely subsidizing the other. Maybe because they have a flat rate, which is going to really hammer an industrial customer, but favor the residential class.
Three-phase demand, sorry, just don't know what that is.
Three-phase demand, it's your large, let's put it in simple terms, it's your very large commercial users.
Right.
So if you have a grain dryer, if you have a gravel pit, if you have ethanol plant, and then grain elevators,
if I'm reading you right, you asked the council to respond on like the 3% wave or swing.
Mm-hmm.
If you would go with a less of one, it would take more years.
No. See, that's not
it.
The overall increase. If you add up all overall, this bottom number,
Right.
if you look at this total,
Is it 750?
I'm going to give you two new tables when I design the rates, and the bottom is going to say 14.9. And these on the side, the difference of, instead of saying, it's going to say revenue existing rates, revenue proposed rates. And those percentages are going to have to be between 11.9 and 17.9, and the total is going to be 14.9, no matter what.
Because the different classes uses different amounts.
For
of
a
electricity.
specific example, this three-phase main, and that's why, now that I hear that you got a grain elevator, which is traditionally a very low load factor, which basically means a load factor is the percentage of energy that you use based on your peak load. So, if you just looked at a grain elevator, very low load factor, huge amount of peak energies, requires a lot of energy, but for a short period of time. They might only run twice a year, maybe once a year. And so they'll have this huge peak energy, and then they'll run nothing, almost nothing, for months and months and months. Well, for a utility, you have to build all this transformer capacity, all these poles, all this three-phase service, all these things in place for that peak demand, and yet they only run just a little bit, so you're not recovering any energy revenue. So you have to have a demand component in there to recover that, and usually a ratchet, because you're going to be charged a ratchet on your demands. And so the equation I give is, it's like if you're in Lincoln, Nebraska, and you have, sorry, I'm a Lincoln from Lincoln. If you're in Lincoln, Nebraska, and you have to build a hotel and meet the load no matter what. Well, I'm going to have to build a huge hotel for the Nebraska game day. And I'm going to build this enormous hotel that fits 6 days a year when everybody comes in to watch game days. But then, all the other days of the year it sits dormant. And I'm going to lose a lot of money because I'm paying for all this overhead that I'm not recovering any revenue on. That's the example of a low load factor. You need to recover some sort of revenue in that case. That's why they're a little bit lower. So if you looked at that, for example, they're subsidizing, and Scott and I were looking at these residential and rural residential rates, and I think some of the discrepancy we're talking about a little bit, and some of it might due to where things are underground versus overhead. And so these are preliminary, but that's the point. We'll look, once we get all these numbers figured out, we'll look and say, that grain dryer needs to have a higher demand. And so we might give them more towards, say, a 16% or 16.5% increase, whereas the other commercial customers get slightly less, maybe a 14 or 14.5. It just gives us some sort of working room to move some rates closer to cost of service. Because these percentages are going to change every year. We're not going to give the three-phase demand 26.9 and one 6.4, because next year we'll be toying with them again. You just slowly work within a window and slowly pull customers closer to where they need to be. And Lakeview's way ahead of the game. They're really not that far out of line. I was telling Scott I have to work with some customers that have flat rates, and I just have to pull teeth to get them to go separate their customers from residential to general service, or what you call commercial. So you are ahead of the game. It's really not that far out of whack, but still like to have some sort of window so I can move some customers. And like I said, it doesn't mean somebody's going to get 17.9. Maybe public authority will, but it doesn't mean somebody's going to get 11.9 either. So